Do you know what Mafia 1, GTA 3 and Crazy Taxi have in common? Nothing. Besides the taxes. But do you know what Sonic, God of War and Prince of Persia have in common? All of these games are part of the Edgy era of the 2000s video games. This is what I'm gonna talk about in this video, and until the end I'll tell you why this happened and how this ended. To understand why this happened, we need to go back to the beginning of gaming. Okay, we didn't need to go back that far. 1983, the year the industry collapsed in the West. The most famous console at the time was the Atari 2600, with games like Pitfall, Enduro and Custer's Revenge. Wait, he's raping a woman? At the time, with the success of this new thing that was video games, companies tried to enter this marketing by releasing their games. But they were just companies without any artistic vision and just wanted to suck as money as possible without caring about the quality of the products. So the industry became saturated with so many bad and generic games being released, which resulted in gaming dying in the West and both consoles and games being left stranded in stores.
Sounds familiar.
Also in 1983, the Nintendo Family Computer, aka Famicom, was released, and 2 years later in 1985, when Nintendo wanted to release this console in the West, cause the marketing was already saturated, they had to completely redesign the console so that would look like a toy. From this, the Nintendo Entertainment System, or just NES, was born.
Whoa, nice graphics!
It had this name precisely so that people would buy it thinking it was a toy and not a console. Like, look parents, this isn't a video game, it's an entertainment system, just fucking buy it! And that's why the NES received so many accessories like the Zapper gun, the robot called Rob, the Power Glove,
I love the Power Glove, it's so bad.
the carpet, I don't remember the name, and so many others.
Okay, look Morphx, this new toy barf here works like this. You take these two things that look like video game controls, but aren't video game controls, because this is not a video game. But then in these things that look like a console, but it's not a console, because it's an entertainment system actually. But these things that look like a cartridge, but not actually a cartridge, because you know, it's not a video game. Turn the entertainment system on and started playing in this regard. Wait a minute.
At the time, to prevent the NES from suffering from the same problem as Atari, the Nintendo seal of quality was created to guide consumers to buy the best games. And from there, many franchises became famous, like Mega Man, Kirby's Adventure, Duck Hunt, The Legend of Zelda, Metroid and the classic Super Mario Bros. That already came with the console. And something that all these games had in common was their focus on platform and their childish visuals. Look at the design of Kirby, Mario or even Link. Look at the cover art of these games except Mega Man. Look at these colorful visuals, you look and automatically assimilate it to something childish. At the time of the NES, there were no research to create more realistic games, so even those that in theory should be more serious like Ninja Gaiden and Castlevania wouldn't be seen by parents in such a serious way, especially with cartoons like Captain N, where Simon Belmont for Castlevania appears in a totally childish version.
Yes, I'm Simon Belmont.
I guess. Apart from the large number of licensed games like the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles one, the Batman one and the Spider-Man one, probably many parents who choose the games they would give to their children would think, oh, my son watches the Batman cartoon on TV, I'm gonna give him this Batman game because he'll probably like it. And I say this because, you know, my parents were like that when I was a kid. What I mean is that at the time, video games were seen as a children's thing. And even though this type of view was already common in the Atari era, Nintendo's marketing to sell the NES in the West and the most popular games on the console corroborate this. And the same story was repeated on the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis. I'm not gonna talk about the Master System in this video cause, you know, it's pretty irrelevant to the conclusion I reached at the end, but I think it's extremely obvious that the Sega Genesis marketing was extremely focused on being cool and look how radical we are, while Nintendo had these children games like Super Mario World, we have Sonic the Hedgehog, which is much better. Look at these games like Altered Beast, Shinobi and Golden Axe, while you guys from Super Nintendo are playing A Link to the Past, Super Metroid. What a gay kid thing, dude. But honestly, this was far from being an attempt of their part to escape the image of video games being for children. This approach by Sega was much more related to them wanting to rival Nintendo, and the approach was to try to show kids how the Sega Genesis was cooler. Not this cooler. And at the end of the day, Sega's icon at the time was still a mascot for kids, even though Sonic is radical than Mario. And of course, the same thing that happened in the NES Gen happened in the Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo Gen. Due to the limitations of the time, it wasn't possible to make a 100% realistic game. So even games that in theory should be more serious ended up going unnoticed, like Shining Force and Gauntlet 4. And maybe that's why when really violent games started appearing, like Doom and Mortal Kombat, that there was no censorship on the Sega Genesis, parents were so shocked. Once again, cause video games were seen as a children's thing. Meanwhile, Nintendo maintained its strategy already used on the NES. The Super Famicom became the Super Nintendo, the accessories still existed. Okay, maybe not so exaggerated. And of course, having the classics Mario, Kirby, Mega Man X, and the newest Donkey Kong Country, once again reinforcing the childish image that video games had at the time. The 50th gen was the most neutral. Due to technological advance, more serious games began to appear. Tomb Raider, Resident Evil, Twisted Metal, Silent Hill, even sequels to existing games that are supposed to be serious could now prove to be games with a more mature approach. Chrono Cross has a much more serious visual presentation than Chrono Trigger. Final Fantasy VII has a much more serious visual presentation than the NES and Super Nintendo games. These games were more serious and mature cause they really had a visual approach and much deeper story than games from previous gens. The 50th gen doesn't need to prove that they were serious, they just used the technology of that time to tell deeper stories with a more mature approach. And yet many childish games emerged at the time. Rayman on Atari Jaguar, Crash Bandicoot on PlayStation, Banjo-Kazooie on Nintendo 64, and talking about Nintendo 64, here Nintendo continued with more childish approach with games like Super Mario 64, Donkey Kong 64, Bomberman 64, Star Fox 64, My Peanuts 64, even Conquer a Bad Fur Day, which was a complete adult and politically incorrect game, had a childish visual presentation. In any case, even though more mature games already existed, video games were still seen as a children's thing. And perhaps this created a need to prove itself on the part of the game industry. Show people that video games were not just toys, but also a form of media like movies, TV shows, books, and others. The 60th gen arrived, and with the growth of gaming and the technological advancement, perhaps it was time to prove that video games were something more. And it was then, in the 2000s, that the edgy era of video games began, where games started trying to prove how adult, dark, and serious they were. For example, Sonic, the games from the Sega Genesis era were very childish. Even though they had a cool and radical side, it was clearly still childish. But from Sonic Adventure onwards, things started to change. Sonic got bigger, his fur got darker. In fact, everyone's design got even cooler and more radical. But okay, the real edgy part of Sonic arrived in Adventure 2, where they introduced Shadow, and with the success of the character, Shadow the Hedgehog was released. The new spin-off where Shadow would be the protagonist. And he uses weapons. Even the trailers for this game were extremely edgy, with Shadow riding a motorcycle, rock songs playing in the background, everything dark and black looking like Gotham City, with catchphrases like the ultimate weapon, darker, stronger, faster. Seems like Shadow defeating Sonic, the simple juice of edgy. The following year, Sonic 06 was released, also with an edgy approach, bringing Shadow back. Now there's Silver, who came from the future, and look how Silver is cool. Now there's Mathless. Eggman's design is more realistic, the story is completely serious. There's even Sonic kissing a human. And in 2007, Sonic Unleashed was released, where Sonic turns into a werewolf and has levels at night, and look how Werehog is dark and edgy. Sonic during the 60th gen and the beginning of the 70th gen went in a totally edgy direction. Not to mention Sonic and the Secret Rings and Sonic and the Black Knight. I think the case of these two is quite obvious. Black Knight is practically a edgy version of Monty Python. Crash Bandicoot was very good during the 50th gen when the games were made by Naughty Dog. After that, the franchise was never able to maintain the same level of quality. And I don't like Crash to Insanity. The point is that in 2007, Crash of the Titans was released, a game where Crash has a tribal tattoo. Now he punches and kicks enemies and can control them using all their skills. Look how cool these monsters are, look at their spikes, look how muscular they are. Look at this one that's like a red mammoth, look at this elephant, look at this gorilla. Even the masks have a radical and cool design now. Crash of the Titans didn't go for a darker side, but it clearly tried to be as radical as possible. possible. And sequel Crash Mind Over Mutant, these remained the same. Look how hot Coco became, look how the design of the monsters became even cooler. Look at these cutscenes with Dragon Ball Z animation, look how we changed the crunch design 2 times. Now there's even a ghost that stops time. Crash always had this somewhat radical side, but that was only in the visual part of the character itself, and it was very little. At most you can talk about his mohawk, but from Twinsanity onwards, where his design was changed a little by adding knee pads and things instead of the classic blue pants, it became clear that things were changing. Crash of the Titans and Might Over Mutants were the pinnacle of this. 2 games that, in addition to burying the franchise for almost 10 years, served to leave their legacies amid these 2 edgy games of the 2000s. Of course, Crash of the Titans, Might Over Mutant, and Sonic Unleashed, especially Sonic Unleashed, also suffered from another phenomenon, which was the hack and slash spanning the 60th gen after their success of Devil May Cry and God of War. But the point is that practically all the mascots died or were in decline at the time. Crash tried to adapt and failed. Sonic tried to adapt and at least managed to stay. Even Bomberman was transformed into a robot. I don't fucking know what the fuck is this. They turned Bomberman into this thing to try to adapt and also failed. Simple cause that wasn't the gen of mascots, but of serious realistic games with heavy plots, weapons, violence. Look at God of War for example. In practically all games of the 60th and 70th gen, there is a sex mini game that if it didn't exist in the games, it wouldn't make any difference. It's just there to show how God of War is adult and mature. Prince of Persia, which existed since MS-DOS, received the game Sands of Time, which was a normal game, but from Water Within onwards, the game went much more edgy with violence and let's focus on this woman's butt cause that's what everyone wants. While Super Mario, who had saved the industry in the West decades ago and chose not to adapt, received Mario Sunshine, which is one of the most whatever games in the franchise. Even The Legend of Zelda suffered from this with Zelda Wind Waker. Ironically, the only successful mascots of the 60th gen were Jak and Daxter, Sly Cooper, and Ratchet and Clank. I don't need to tell you why. In summary, video games were seen as a children's thing since the Atari era, but thanks to Nintendo's marketing with the NES, the fact that the majority of the most famous games of the 80s and 90s were focused on children and the lack of research that limited games with a more serious proposal and didn't make their visual presentation clear, corroborate this type of vision, which may have generated a need in the industry to show people that video games were also a form of art and not just toys. And when the 60th gen arrived, developers used the popularity of gaming and the technology of the time to create overly serious games with weapons, violence, blood, death, all this to get rid of the childish image that video games had. This ended up impacting mascots since many of the most famous franchises were mascots and most of them either died in this gen or were forgotten. Some who tried to adapt managed to at least survive, some who tried to adapt failed, those who didn't adapt had a bad time, and the few mascots that were created at the time were successful cause their games were released with the mentality of the gen.
But Morphx, even adapting the mascot continued to decline the 6th gen and many of them failed to adapt and sank completely, how did the trend of the edgy games end? What really made people stop considering video games as some things for kids?
Well, the answer is quite simple. What made this era of edgy games end, what made people stop considering video games as something for children, was no one of these games. Wasn't GTA, wasn't God of War, wasn't Prince of Persia, wasn't any of that. What truly ended this era were the players themselves. It turns out that the kids of the 80s became the adults of the 2000s, the kids of the 90s became the adults of the 2010s, and the kids of the 2000s became the adults of today. And these people know the importance of video games in their lives. Many of these kids who grew up wanted to create their own games. So from the middle of the 70th gen onwards, there was the explosion of indie games like Minecraft, Angry Birds, Plants vs Zombies, games with a very different artistic styles that stray us from the realism that the AAA industry sold so much. Minecraft is all square, Plants vs Zombies is cartoony, Limbo has all this black and white aesthetic, Shovel Knight is 16-bit, Undertale is based on Earthbound. Maybe it's cause of this explosion of indie games that mascots abandoned the seriousness they had acquired in the 60th gen, and many who died in the 60th gen returned in the 70th or 80th gen. Sonic returned to being colorful and relaxed with Sonic Colors and Sonic Generations. Mario returned returned to the top with Galaxy 1 and Galaxy 2. Rayman Origins and Rayman Legends were released. Kirby received Return to Dreamland. Donkey Kong Country literally returns. Perhaps even the fact that the Nintendo Wii was the best-selling console of the gen was another fact, with much more cartoonish games for you to play with the whole family. And at the time the serious and realistic games continued to exist, but with all the edgy and exaggerated parts, mascot games also regained their space in the industry. The success of the Nintendo Wii and the explosion of indie games were probably what changed the industry. But of course, this is just my opinion. Now I want you to leave in the comments the reason why this era of edgy games existed in the 2000s and why it ended. I really wanna read your comment, man. And bye.